千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I would like to extend a warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. So now, without further ado, let us continue with Tao Te Ching, chapter 13. As we discussed last time, this is the favor and disgrace chapter, all about the positive and negative feedback that we encounter in life. Favor and disgrace form a complementary duality that is well represented by the yin and yang symbol. And as we spoke of previously, when we talk about positive and negative feedback, it's a generic term. It includes opinions, attitudes, behaviors, and so on, which can all have a powerful effect on us. This is to say, until we learn the Tao and realize that they don't need to influence us in a way that make us do things we would not otherwise do. So I find that this chapter is profound but also practical, like so many of the chapters in the Tao Te Ching. Here is the chapter itself, 16 lines, which we were able to divide into multiple sections. As you can see, the divisions here, we've divided this into 4 sections, starting with 2 lines. And the 2 lines are statements that are further expanded in sections 2 and 3. Line 1 corresponds to section 2, which is composed of lines 3 to 7. Line 2 references the section below in the 3rd section from line 8 to line 12. And then we have the conclusion in the 4th and final section, which is all about the world. The world, 天下, in this case, representing something greater than yourself. So we will talk more about that. Now, previously, we were able to cover the first half of this chapter, from line 1 to line 7. There's a couple of key lines that we want to cover in a recap. You're going to see line 3 and line 7 as those 2 important lines that basically summarize everything. So starting with line 3. Line 3 is asking the question, what does favor and disgrace make one fearful mean? So this is framed as a question. And then further down below in line 7, Lao Tzu provides the answer This is what it means when we say favor and disgrace make one fearful. And the explanation is, as you can see right above it in lines 5 and 6. Why do they make one fearful? Because having either the good opinion or bad opinion of others will make one fearful, anxious, unsettled. And conversely, losing either the positive or the negative opinions or feedback of others, that can also cause one anxiety attacks. So whether having it or losing it, they have a similar effect in disturbing the mind. So why would that be? We will explore that. But for now, this is what was meant when Lao Tzu wrote, favor and disgrace make one fearful. So this is the very quick recap that I have for you to cover the information that we talked about last time. Now, let's go beyond the first section, the bottom line of which is line 7. So let's go beyond line 7 into line 8. Line 8 says, what does the greatest misfortune is the self mean? So to talk about this, we should hone in, zoom in on the key character there, Huan. Here's the pinyin for that. And you see the same character in line 8 as well as 9. So I've highlighted both in red. You can see that it's translated as misfortune. And the meaning for this character, trouble, misery, anxiety, and therefore translated as misfortune. Now you put the character da in front of it, which means big, vast, grand, great. You get 大患, which means a great deal of trouble, great misery, a lot of anxiety, or as translated, great misfortune. And note that these two characters together, they are repeated in line 8 and line 9. The reason why they're repeated is for emphasis, and the reason for the emphasis is that it may not be so obvious why self, the concept of self, leads to great misfortune. We all have the self. We talk about when we point to ourselves, we say, me, myself, and I. This is not a foreign concept to us. We all have it. So why does it lead to great misfortune? That's the topic to talk about. It is by no means obvious, and that is the reason why Lao Tzu brings it up. It is very similar to the Buddhist concept that attachment leads to suffering. So we can start there as the beginning point. In order to be free of suffering, according to Buddhist Dharma, you must first free yourself, liberate yourself of attachments. So mapping it back to the Tao Te Ching, in order to avoid misfortune, you must liberate yourself of the self. And here, the self will be in terms of egocentric or selfish thinking. We'll talk a lot more about this in the later slides. For now, let's take a look at the entire line. The entire line, what does the greatest misfortune is the self mean? Well, to start with, the sages realize, they recognize, acknowledge that we must have the self in order to function. And at the same time, they see the flip side of it, which is that just like everything else in life, if the self was to get out of control, it can cause problems or issues for us. So the quickest example, perhaps the most obvious, is that they see excessive self-importance as a problem that is affecting most people. And now we can begin to see why Lao Tzu frames this as a question. He wants to emphasize its importance, and that is why he's not making just a direct statement. He's not just saying that, well, hey, listen, the greatest misfortune is the self. That's it. A very emphatic statement on its own. He is basically putting the spotlight on this concept. The self can be seen as affecting our decisions, our actions, our thoughts. It can, taken to an extreme, become an affliction. That is, it can cause us issues, it can cause us problems. So it is both affecting us and it can also be afflicting us. Now, this is by no means unique to us. The sages have observed throughout history, they look at society, they look at people, they see how in every walk of life, arrogance leads to misfortune. And this is true from nobility to commoners alike. It covers everyone. It covers them as well. The scholars, the philosophers, the sages themselves, the Tao cultivators, no one is immune from the effects or the affliction of arrogance. And at the end of the day, this is precisely why he felt that it was so important to draw attention to it, repeating the same line multiple ways within the same chapter in order to underline, underscore its importance. So we need to direct the same kind of attention, the same kind of importance to it ourselves, focusing on great misfortune as it is connected with the self. And the first task for us is to be clear on exactly what the self is referring to. We start with the physical self. The physical self is simply your body. So, what exactly are the troubles or misfortune that the physical self can lead us into? Well, in the previous chapter, chapter 12, it talks a lot about the 5 colors, the 5 sounds, and 5 flavors. These are all manifestations of the material world. Because we have sensory input, we are constantly tempted and distracted by all of these manifestations. They provide us with all these colorful distractions, sensations, pleasures, thrills. It would be very easy, especially for those without guidance, to be pulled off the path and end up becoming lost among the world of the 5 colors, 5 sounds, and the 5 flavors. Another way that the physical self can get us into problems or issues is, well, a natural part of life. From birth, the physical self is subjected to discomfort, pain, injuries, illnesses, the process of aging, and the prospects of death. So these are unavoidable. We all experience them from greater to lesser extents. They're ever present. At any time, you can stub your toes, you can unintentionally hit something, cause yourself some pain or discomfort. In any particular day, we can get sick, we can accidentally injure ourselves, and even if nothing bad happens, even if we don't stub our toes, we go through a day without stumbling, falling, etc. Even on a good day, we're still just aging. The next day, you and I are a day older. And when we have enough of these days that add up to weeks, months, and years, we begin to feel the toll that the years take on us. Sooner or later, we feel the weakening effects of aging, and we know that we are approaching, slowly but surely, the end of this lifetime. So unavoidable, inevitable, affecting all of us, and it's part of the problems or issues that the self can cause from the physical perspective. And there's one more category. If you think about our physical selves, it is also inevitable that we link it to physical appearance. We can become overly attached to physical beauty and external appearance. And from experience, we know that it can be deceptive. So that's another way that physicality can cause problems or issues for us. Whether it's by being misled by someone else due to appearance, or excessive focus on the appearance that we project to others. And for that reason, in chapter 2 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu specifically pointed out, when the world knows beauty as beauty, ugliness arises. We begin to divide and categorize. Someone is good looking, not great looking, so-so, and everything in between. So that tends to be a cause of consternation. Now, aside from the physical self, what about the mental aspects of oneself? So we can talk about the mental self. The physical self is the body, the mental self is the mind. And when Lao Tzu talks about the self, he's actually including both. So in this chapter that we're studying right now, 13, Lao Tzu is pointing out how the insecure self, your mind, is fearful of being criticized or fearful of losing the good opinions of others. That is the main theme of this right here, of this chapter. Now, there's more because chapter 13 is also pointing out how the self can be startled by praise. Not just criticism, it can be startled by praise, and it can worry about the loss of criticisms, like what's going on. There used to be a lot of criticisms, and now it's silence. I don't like this. That type of feeling. So whether it's gain or loss, favor or disgrace, the mind becomes unsettled and anxious. So there's another way that the mind can lead us into problems. This is common. This is something that we see in our world all the time. when the self cannot sense its oneness with everything, it sees instead the illusion of separateness and division. What do I mean by that? Here I'm talking about us versus them. I'm talking about the tribal mentality. We see this almost every day. Sometimes we see it in sports team rivalries. Other times we see it in the polarization of our society. Either way, it plays out the same. People pick a side and then they cast themselves in the role of heroes versus the villains on the other side. In sports rivalries, it's perhaps one city versus another, one college or university versus another. We're better than you guys is the message. And in a note of discomfort, we only need to dig a little deeper to go from we're better than you to the underlying assumption, which is we are superior, you are inferior. That is division, that is separateness. Very common and therefore taken for granted, but then it also goes to extremes, which has all kinds of detrimental effects on our society. So that's definitely another huge way that the mind, the mental self, can get us, all of us, into trouble. And let's talk about one more. The deluded mind. The deluded self, mental self, identifies with and associates value to things that are really outside of it, outside of the self. Your net worth, whatever titles you may possess, your position in the social hierarchy in an organization, your possessions. So all these together, power, positions, possessions, these are the things that delude the mental self or the mind, and we're fooled into thinking that these have actual value or worth in the grand scale, in the grand scheme of things in the universe or existence. When this is something that was observed by the ancient sages and Lao Tzu, he worked it into the Tao Te Ching. He wrote about goods that are difficult to acquire make one cause damage. Damage to life, damage to one's relationships, family, loved ones, all kinds of damage. So I wanted to present this slide to make it clear exactly what it is we're talking about when we're referring to the self. It's this right here. Let's continue on. Line 9, the reason I have great misfortune. So let's analyze it, starting with the first character. Wu. The meaning of this character, this is I in classical Chinese. This is the Chinese that was used in ancient times. And by the way, I want to mention something. Recently, I came across examples where people talk about ancient Mandarin. This is a bit of a misnomer. Let me explain. Mandarin did not come into the picture of Chinese history until the Qing dynasty, which is the final dynasty of Chinese history. So Mandarin was the regional dialect of the invaders that took over China and became the Qing dynasty. From that point on, Mandarin. So ancient Mandarin only goes back hundreds of years. Ancient Chinese is what was spoken prior to that. And you see traces of it still in regional dialects like Hokkien, Cantonese, etc. It's different. Now, not knowing how this history evolved, many people just assumed that in the time of Lao Tzu, he spoke and wrote ancient Mandarin. No, there's no such thing. So just wanted to make sure people understand the difference between classical Chinese and modern Mandarin. Today, using modern Mandarin, if we want to say I, we would use a different character, 我, as you can see there, and not 吾. So back to this line, when Lao Tzu wrote this character 我, 吾, in ancient times, he is referring to himself. He's saying me. He's saying, well, I'm not exempt from the misfortunes caused by the ego. Just because I study the Tao, cultivate the Tao, that doesn't make me an exception. So the reason I have great misfortune, this is acknowledging that him, Lao Tzu himself, when he lets his sense of self get out of control, he also brings about misfortune for himself. So let's continue. So focusing on both line 9 and line 10 now. Line 9 says, the reason I have great misfortune, and then line 10, is that I have the self. And because we have just seen that slide that expands upon exactly what the self covers, now you know exactly what Lao Tzu is pointing to. So first, his point, the excessive self, the sense of self, self-centrism, is an issue for all human beings in the material world. Nobody is an exception to that, so the scope includes not just Lao Tzu, but all the Tao sages as well. Then, line 10, well, as I mentioned, they realize, Lao Tzu and the Tao sages absolutely understand that we need the physical self to navigate our environment. We have legs, feet that give us mobility. We get to move around. We get to go from here to there. That's the physical self. Then we need the mental self, the mind, to interact with each other in society. Whenever you and I converse, whenever we interact in some way, it is the mind within me and the mind within you that is driving the interactions. Now, the self, whether it's physical or mental, it is a concept that's consistent with other concepts in the Tao, which means ideas like moderation can be applied to it as well, the sense of self. When the self is kept to balance and moderation, the self becomes an excellent tool for us to use. And as you see here, we use it to navigate our environment, to interact with other people. But then, when we're out of balance, when the sense of self is unbalanced, excessive, extreme, it becomes a detriment to life. It becomes a force for misery and misfortune. So continuing on, I want to keep our focus on line 10, but then also bring in line 11. Line 10 talks about Lao Tzu saying, well, it's because I have the self. And then line 11, again, still Laozi saying, if I have no self, okay, this is important, no self. We'll come back to it. First, let's talk about because I have the self. Laozi is saying, it is because I have an overblown ego that I get myself in trouble. So this is something that demonstrates that Tao sages in general, Laozi in particular, certainly Zhuangzi as well, they all express naturally this humble self-concept. They do not assume that they must be right, others must be wrong. They do not assume that they practice the Tao perfectly, flawlessly. Indeed, they see themselves as human beings who are flawed and who need to constantly remind themselves, review their actions to become better. Now, they definitely put their finger on it. They identify that the moment the sense of self becomes arrogance, that is when the problems begin. That's the genesis, that's the origin of the problems. Now, next we tackle line 11, which is if I have no self. Let me make a note here. When you see these bullet points here, it's about ego, it's about arrogance. These are aspects of the mental self. I want to just remind everyone to not forget that there is also the physical self. And the reminder is that our bodies, the body itself brings its own issues, and that can include overstimulation, becoming jaded, becoming exhausted, lacking energy, overindulgence, and even addiction. The physical body has its own set of issues and problems and challenges. So not something to be overlooked. I want to put a pin into that just to kind of remind all of us. Now, let's talk about wu sen, no self. So here's Laozi saying, continuing, that if I can do without this self-centered thinking, that is affliction, that is a mental affliction, then I can manage my ego. If I am able to manage my ego, then I can see the beginning of the solution for the problems. My troubles in life will diminish. They will decrease in frequency. They will decrease in severity so that I can deal with them more easily. This is reflected in the line that follows, line 12. Line 12 says, what misfortune do I have? So this is important enough that I want to break it down character by character. So literally, we got 4 characters here. The first character, as I mentioned, this is the ancient Chinese, classical Chinese way of writing I. Instead of 我, this is 无. So the first character is I. The second character is a simple character. It just means have. I have. The third character is what. And the last character we have seen already. We associate that with misfortune. We put da, big, in front of it, and we get great misfortune. Here, it's just generically problems, issues, challenges. So this is a question. I have what problems? Or, as translated, what misfortune do I have? And you can also translate it as what problems do I have? So the basic idea is simple. I free myself from my ego, I liberate myself spiritually, then I can stop worrying about external opinions that lead me to feeling fearful, to being anxious, feeling unsettled. When that happens, the logical consequence is that both favor and disgrace lose their impact, their power, their effect on me. So specifically, praise, compliments, good opinions, praise no longer blinds me and make my head swell up. That's important. What about the flip side? What about not praise, but criticism and condemnation? Criticism will no longer devastate me and ruin my entire day. So with the overblown sense of importance, I'm affected by praise as well as criticism. When I'm able to manage everything in perspective, then suddenly praise and criticism lose their power. And now, let's bring everything together. All three lines. Lao Tzu saying, well, it's because I have the self that I have all these problems. If I don't have the self, what problems do I have? What misfortune do I have? He says. So we have two levels of interpretation for these lines. And you're going to see that these two interpretations are very consistent with everything that we have talked about. Starting with level 1. The physical self inevitably gets into trouble in the material world. And we talked about potential problems, the overindulgence, overstimulation, the addiction, etc. Now, of course, if we do not have the physical self, then we're just spiritual entities. And we can see that without the physical self, as only spiritual entities, we would not have these problems. So that's level 1. But let's talk about level 2, the other side of it. An excessive sense of self gets us into trouble all the time. And I think you know what I mean by now. Excessive sense of self, the head swelling up too big, feeling like you are the greatest in the world without justification, deluded into thinking, this overinflated sense of self-importance. So what if we can reduce this excess? Well, by reducing this excess, we also reduce the problems. If somehow we're able to let go of all of it, we sidestep all the problems. So this is definitely an important point that Lao Tzu is making. So now, having talked about the self covering those basics, I also want to get back to the idea of no self and in the Tao, the true self. So these are concepts that I think you will find to be very useful. So I'm going to start with Buddhist Dharma. This is to say, Dharmic teachings deriving from the original Buddha from 2,500 years ago. So in Buddhism today, this is a concept, 无我, anatta. This is the doctrine of non-self. Non-self instead of no self. And the doctrine of anatta says there's no eternal essence of the self that can be found anywhere. Anatta says this idea of an eternal soul, it cannot be found among the 10,000 dharmas. That is to say, dharmic manifestations, that's just another expression to describe everything that we see all around us in this material existence. Now, everything in the world we know is constantly changing. Nothing remains constant, and therefore, there's nothing in it that is lasting, that is permanent, that is eternal. Now, in the original teachings of the Buddha himself declined to address the existence of the self. He specifically said, we're not going to talk about that. And the reason is because the question on whether or not an eternal self, eternal essence of you exists, that question itself leads to an attachment. Now, attachments to the concept of the self, just like all attachments, lead to craving and suffering. And that's the reason why the Buddha did not want to address whether it existed or did not exist. Now, let me point out here on the left-hand side of the slide that the basic idea in Buddhism is the same as this part of the Tao Te Ching, chapter 13 that we're studying. Buddhism is basically stating attachment to the self leads to craving and suffering. Lao Tzu wrote, the self leads to misfortune. These are similar words talking about the same thing. As a side note, the whole concept of anatta, non-self versus no self, often interpreted as the self does not exist, but it's a debatable point. Even today, 2,500 years after the time of Buddha, it is still being discussed and debated all the time. And sometimes people don't realize that the Buddha specifically did not want to assert philosophical non-existence of the self. That's Buddhism. Now, let's switch over to the Tao. This is one of the significant ways where the Tao concepts are different from the original teachings of the Buddha and the doctrine that has evolved over the years, over the centuries. First, let's talk about 本性, the true self. This is your original nature, and sometimes sages will say it's just your nature. It's your natural self, your original self. This is the you that remains constant. It is just you, no matter what else about you changes. You can change so many different aspects of yourself, and your true self will never change. You're just you. The true self is like a mathematical point. A point in math exists. It's there. But the point has no dimension. It takes up no space. Conceptually takes up no space. If you draw a point on a piece of paper, it's a small dot. It has a small dimension. But that is describing a point that is dimensionless. That cannot really be measured. It has zero width conceptually. Now, when you compare the true self with no self or non-self, you can begin to see one of the divergent perspectives between Buddhist Dharma and the Tao perspective. Buddhist Dharma asks the question, what is the true self? The Tao perspective responds with, well, whatever it is that ultimately originated this question, that is the true self. Whatever was ultimately asking, what is the true self, is the true self. Buddhist Dharma may then say, there are people who really insist on this, the self does not exist, anatta. But the Tao perspective would be, whatever it is that ultimately originated this thought, this assertion, this statement, that is the true self. So the true self is what the source was for the idea that the true self does not exist. And therefore, it's there, like a mathematical point. Now, this is reflected in Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is a fusion of Buddhist teachings and Tao teachings in ancient times. In Zen Buddhism, it is called self-nature, 自性. Self-nature is described as that which is originally pure, complete, and the source of all manifestations in your life. So the teaching which I really love is that the self-nature is pure. Nothing can be added to it or subtracted from it. The self-nature is complete in the sense that you already have everything you need for any purpose you may have in mind, for anything you may wish to do, for any goal you may wish to accomplish. It's complete in and of itself. And then let's talk about it as the source. When I say that it is the source of manifestations in your life, the original expression is that the self-nature gives rise to the 10,000 dharmas, which means everything in your life, the good as well as the bad. So everything is sourced in you. Everything in your life can be traced back to self-nature. So that's from Zen Buddhism. And here is the most important part. Your physical self and mental self, that is to say, your body and your mind, these are layers over the true self. They are subject to change, and they are what lead to misfortunes. And just as a reminder, the mental self includes everything that happens in your mind. Memories, thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, concepts, learnings, everything. Note that you change your mind all the time on different things. Your memories are constantly changing. You remember and forget different things all the time. So the mental self, subject to constant change. Of course, we talked about the body as the physical self. We know that it's going through constant changes from one moment to the next. The metaphor here is that we all have different clothes that we wear for different occasions. For instance, you put on business attire for work. You wear casual attire to relax. You may put on swimwear for a dip in the pool. You may put on formal attire to attend an event, and so on. Different clothing for different purposes, different events, different occasions. Now pull back to the perspective of eternity and multiple lifetimes. The different bodies you wear or inhabit or use as the vessel of your physical existence, the different bodies are like the different clothes that you wear for different purposes on different days. The bodies that you put on, the families, the environment, the circumstances, people around you, interactions, relationships with them, the things that you use, all are manifestations sourced in self-nature in accordance with karmic mechanisms for the purpose of specific lessons and refinements for the spiritual self. So with that framework, let me share this. This is just a depiction of the true self, which in the Tao is like a mathematical point. Sometimes I say it's a singularity. Now, this is the constant, this is the eternal, this is the permanent, this is the unchanging. Surrounding the true self, there's layers and layers of that which is transient, impermanent, ephemeral. All these things that we wrap around the true self. Ego, sense of self. When I say image, I mean the image that you project for others. Your social veneer or facade, the surface appearance. Reputation, pretty self-explanatory. It is what people think of you. It's the reputation that you have among friends, business associates, other people. Perception, the public perception of you, how people see you, if they pay attention to you. Identity, your social identity, who are you? What is your place in society? Feelings, well, emotions. All of these things change, while the true self does not. All of these things are affected externally, while the true self is unaffected. So in terms of external positive and negative feedback, we start with the positive. As we go through life, sometimes we receive compliments. When we go online, sometimes we see that people have given us a thumbs up on something we posted. That's part of the external validation. It's all part of that positive feedback. Favor and praise. So that positive feedback, it can definitely inflate the ego. So this is the reason why I composed the graphic in this fashion. All the incoming positive feedback is hitting that external layer first. The layer that changes, it does not affect what is the innermost core of your being. They add nothing to your true self. What about the flip side? Well, we get negativity too as we go through life. We get personal attacks, disapproval, ridicule, mockery. So in all of this, I'm talking about your physical presence in reality, but I'm covering everything, and therefore also your online reputation. It's part of your digital self, your website accounts, your profile photos, avatars, everything. So then when you realize how this works, that personal attacks can hurt your feelings. Disapproval can be affecting public perception of you. Ridicule can hit you in your social identity. But no matter what it is, no matter what harm you think they have done, nothing can damage your true self. Nothing can subtract from it or take anything away from it. The true self is the true self. The only thing that are affected are the external layers that are transient and impermanent, that change all the time. The realization here leads us to the insight of how we can become unaffected by favor or disgrace. So here's an example. As we go through stages of life, initially, young age. When we're young, we're probably all the same. We're concerned about how others see you. I cared very much how I was perceived as a child, as a teenager, as someone growing up. Questions on my mind. Do they think I am likable, sociable, respectable? Yeah, I want the respect of my peers as a young guy. Now, life goes on. I make my way to middle age. In that stage of life, I have gained confidence and maturity. I am more confident than I was before as a young man, hopefully more mature than I was before. And therefore, because of that, I don't care as much as I did previously what people think, whether it's good or bad. I'm unaffected by that, and I think I'm doing pretty well. I've become wiser. I'm better at handling the challenges of life. But there's another stage. Old age. In old age, you gain the perspective of experience. Things are winding down. Life is coming to an end. And finally, there's the realization. People were never really thinking that much about you in the first place. So when I was younger, caring about how people thought, well, they weren't really thinking about me all that much. Middle age, no longer care. Wow, that's kind of funny because they weren't really thinking that much about me. So this is the wisdom that comes with age. This is a truer sense. This is a clearer perception of reality. People are overwhelmingly concerned about themselves. They weren't really paying that much attention to me, myself, and I. Therefore, the ego really can and should take a break. Now, this is old age. What I would also say is that no matter what stage of life you're in, you and I can all have this wisdom now. We don't need to wait until we are nearing the end of this lifetime to live wisely with the clarity and this realization. This will let us handle challenges that come our way, whether it's good or bad, positive or negative, favor or disgrace. We can handle all of them with a steady resolve and peaceful calmness that will not be easily swayed, easily manipulated by others, so we won't easily fall prey to emotions leading to rash reactions. And that is consistent with what Lao Tzu says in this chapter when he pointed out 宠辱若驚, that favor and disgrace make one fearful. We get to the solution of it, which is that favor and disgrace do not affect us. 寵辱不驚. And that is the calmness and composure that we're talking about here in the Tao. We are now moving on to the next line, line 13. line 13 says, so one who values the self as the world. Now, I want to single out first the last two characters, which you see repeated at the end of line 13 as well as line 14. 天下. Two characters, and the romanization can be a little misleading, so it sounds like 天下. Literally, the first character is sky or heaven. The second character is below or beneath, so all below heaven, meaning the world. Everything under the sun is our equivalent expression in English. In ancient times, this expression meant the land known to the ancients. Therefore, when the ancients talked about 天下, they often used the term in connection with the ruler, whether that's a king or the ancient emperor of the ancient Chinese Empire. Today, we can also think about 天下 as an individual's personal world. Your world, my world, your existence, my existence, something that we can think of as a personal kingdom, something that we rule over as the king or the queen. Now, taking a look at line 13 as a whole, so one who values the self as the world. To value the self as the world denotes a shift, a transfer. That is to say, instead of valuing the self as most people do, value the world. And the world, even though in ancient times, it meant the ancient kingdom or the ancient empire, everything that was known. Here, the context is just something that's greater than yourself. Your world involving your family, your friends, community, or a group of people. Now, when I talk about the shift or the transfer, what I mean is there's a shift that occurs when you care more about the group of people, than you do about yourself. That their interests, their best interests matter more to you than your self-interest. When that is the case, then Lao Tzu says, someone who can make that shift, that person can be given the world. Now, because we're using the term the world to talk about a group, community, family, friends, etc., here we want to further be clear that when you take on responsibility for the world, it means you become responsible for the welfare of many. To an ancient ruler, that responsibility is to everyone in the kingdom, all the people of the kingdom. For you, it just means the totality of your worldly existence. Now, to be responsible for that, or to even take on more responsibilities, the ideal person is the one who is not out for himself or herself. And the reason why it is important for us to study this is because it provides a guidance. Note that oftentimes we see the opposite in the world, that those who are out to enrich themselves would be the rule rather than the exception. And yet at the same time, we can see that these people out to enrich themselves, they should not be the ones to be given power. If power corrupts, well, it can even be worse for them because they are already corrupt. So we can then recognize that people who transcend this kind of egocentric thinking are the people who can serve in a selfless way. And for them to be given the world, in this context, it just means being given stewardship of responsibility. Noting that stewardship is not ownership, it's transient, temporary custodian or caretaker role. Therefore, these teachings from Lao Tzu provide the guidance in the following. Number one, they help us recognize when we should take on greater responsibilities. If there is a cause you believe in, if there is something you care about, well, that can be the beginning of taking on greater responsibilities. The other guidance that this can provide is that this can be helping us recognize when we should follow someone who is in that position. That the person that we should follow has to be the one who is not out for himself or herself. So we can use this as a metric, as a measuring stick to determine if this is a person that is, it'll be worthwhile for us to follow, for us to go in the same direction. So in the Tao, when we talk about this shift, this transition, it goes from self-centered to selfless. This is the character for Shen. That's the self, which, as we talked about, covers the physical self and the mental self. We have pretty much everybody, and then we have the example of the Tao sages. For many people, it's much more self-centered. The focus is exclusively on oneself, one's own interest. And such a person, upon receiving feedback from any direction, positive or negative, the reaction is likely to be startled upon gaining favor and fearful or afraid of losing favor. And if it's negative, well, fearful of disgrace, bad reviews, criticisms, and anxious to lose that negativity. Such a person, self-centered, encounters one misfortune after another over a lifetime. And that is because this person will be going through life subjected to all the influences being pulled in this direction or that based on the external incoming input. So then, on the sage side, they made the transition from being self-centered to being selfless. When they are in that state, they're glad to have external approval, but they're not dependent on that approval. They're fine without it. They know where they're going. They know their own direction. What about negative? What happens when it's negative? They are aware of external criticism, but it doesn't pull them off the path. They remain steady on the path. So this is why we say that they can be trusted with great responsibilities. They can, quote unquote, take care of the world. And when you follow them, you know that the care that usually goes toward the self, they have directed that to something greater. And in just the same way, the sages realize that external approval or criticism are transient at best. Someone who's praising you today may well condemn you tomorrow. So for all of these reasons, they don't become overwhelmed by compliments or naysayers. And that's what makes this chapter so useful for all of us. Lao Tzu points out, one who values the self as the world, that is, becoming selfless, can be given the world. Next line. Line 15 says, one who loves the self as the world. Those who can love the world like most people love themselves. Right off the bat, we can see the similarity between this line and line 13. Value the self as the world. Here, it's swapping out value for love, which is another level deeper. So, the basic idea is the same. The world here is the greater responsibility, something greater than yourself, like a group, an organization, a cause, etc. In this line that we're working with here, all the characters are the same except the first one. Instead of value, love. So the bottom line is, one has to go beyond looking after oneself to attain greatness. If you wish greatness for yourself, this is a must. This is a prerequisite. So at the time of Lao Tzu, in the context of ancient kingdom, this pointed to the ruler, the wise, selfless ruler who would rule with virtue. And what about you, the ruler of your life? In the context of your personal world, this implies a standard to live up to. Now, what might that standard be? Let us continue to the last line of this chapter. Line 16 says, can be entrusted with the world. To be entrusted with the world, at the time of Lao Tzu, for the warring stage period, this meant the ruler and his kingdom. So the world was in that context. The place, the kingdom, the place to rule. For the unified China of old, this meant the emperor and the empire. For you and I, this means taking charge of every aspect of life. Now, I want to be very clear here in one particular point, because not all of us end up with opportunity to take on responsibilities to care for others. So I want to be very clear here. This applies even if you do not take on responsibility for other people. And the reason why I say that is because if you just take on the full control of your own destiny, that by itself can be the greatest responsibility of all. Never mind caring for other people, you need to look after yourself and the unfolding of your own destiny, your own path on the Tao, and your destination. So with these ideas all together, let's talk about these last two lines that is reflected in a story. The last two lines say, one who loves the self as the world can be trusted with the world. You just heard me talk about how the world in this case applied to the context of an ancient king and the kingdom. So there is a story that I would like to share with you to bring that to life. The name of the story is The Compassionate King. It is a story from Zhuangzi. During the spring and autumn period of ancient China, there was a king known for his virtuous rule. His people knew they could always count on him to put their best interests first. There were barbaric tribes who lived to the north of the kingdom. They became increasingly hostile, and they show more and more signs of aggression. The king could see they would soon launch an attack. Wishing to prevent this, he tried to negotiate peace through diplomacy. He sent his first envoy with gifts of skins and silks, but this did not succeed. The tribal leader refused to accept. The king thought perhaps the refusal was due to the gifts being insufficient. He thought about what these tribes might find of value. So for his second attempt, he sent the second envoy with livestock and horses as gifts. Again, the barbarians refused. The king made one last attempt. He sent the third envoy with pearls and jade, the most precious gift he knew. This was met with the same rejection as before. It seemed the barbarians were intent on waging war. The king considered the situation at length, and then he gathered his people together. He described the situation to them, and he explained the wild tribes were not interested in peace because all they wanted was the territory, so they were going to take it by force. He said to them, I know many of you are more than willing to fight, but think about the toll this will take. If you are the older brother, would you want to send your younger brother into battle? If you are a father, would you want to send your son into battle, perhaps to die? I cannot bear for any of that to happen to us. He continued, my children, please make an effort to remain here. You can get along with the barbarians. Between living under my rule and living under their rule, what is the difference? We have been nourished by this land all these years. I do not want it to be a cause in bringing harm to any of us. With this, the king made it clear to everyone that he intended to leave the kingdom, to let the barbarians take it without a fight. This would avoid the bloodshed of battle. So he packed lightly for travel, and then he took up his staff to get started on his self-imposed exile. When he walked to the trail, exiting his kingdom, he was greeted by a surprising sight. Most of his people were waiting for him there. Like him, they were all packed up. They had taken their belongings with them because they all wished to go with him. Wherever he was headed, they would follow. They formed a long, unbroken train of migration through the land. They went far away from their former homes and did not stop until they reached the foot of a distant mountain. There they decided to settle down to establish their kingdom anew. This turned out to be an excellent decision. they had left the barbarians far behind, so they were out of danger. Together, living in safety at the foot of the mountain, the king and his people began rebuilding their peaceful society. The end. So let's talk about what this story is telling us. First of all, when I talked about the spring and autumn period, this was a historical period roughly from 2800 to 2500 years ago. It was the period of time before the Warring States period, which of course was the time of Laozi and later on Zhuangzi. In this story, what Zhuangzi wrote about and the same story was referenced many times in other ancient texts. What Zhuangzi wrote about was that the people could see that the king loved the kingdom as himself. This is perfect correspondence to the last two lines of this chapter of the Tao Te Ching. Because of that love, the king could be entrusted with the kingdom. And here, I would invite everyone to elevate your thinking. The kingdom is not the piece of land. It's the people. That is the kingdom right there. So this kingdom, the people, could be entrusted to this compassionate king. This principle held true throughout history. The primary qualification of great rulers was that they cherished people's lives. This was not always the case. Many rulers throughout history were quite the opposite. They treated the lives of the commoners and the peasants as no great concern, that they could be slaughtered, thrown into battle at a moment's notice. But not this king. What can we take from this and apply to our own lives? Well, several ideas. Number one, like the king, there's nothing wrong in our lives in putting some distance between yourself and a source of toxic negativity. I say that because sometimes we stay in a bad situation with certain misconceptions. Sometimes people think, well, getting away from it would be losing the fight. It would be giving up the struggle, admitting defeat, showing weakness. And I want to offer that isn't necessarily true. Like the king, we need to be open to the idea that there may be little or nothing to be gained from staying behind in a stubborn way. Indeed, it may be a wiser use of time and energy to take yourself someplace else. Second takeaway, if, like the king, you let go of the power and the authority, but then it comes back to you of its own accord, then it's like what they say. If you let it go, but then it comes back, it's yours. Then you know that the power and authority, it comes back on its own, it rightfully belongs to you. That the kingdom was rightfully the king's to rule. So, pulling everything together, we should all approach a greater responsibility with the love of people rather than the lust for power. Or, as Lao Tzu would say, one who loves the self as the world can be entrusted with the world. In other words, who should take on the burden to care for the world? Only those who truly love the world. So this is a story that I wanted to share with you. I feel that it is the perfect ending for the last two lines in this chapter of the Tao Te Ching. We are now just a little bit past the top of the hour, so it is time for us to visit the summary page. Last time, we summarized the whole concept of favor and disgrace, where favor represented by the external approval, external validation from other people, disgrace, the critics and naysayers. Previously, we summarized that most people are very much affected by this. They want external approval, and they can proceed appealing to external approval at the suppression of their authentic selves, their own ideas. As Tao cultivators, what I suggest is that you don't want to ignore external feedback, input, but I would still encourage everyone that you must march to the beat of your own drum. It's the same on the other side. Most people, because they are averse to criticism, they worry about what people think. This can be crippling. And my suggestion last time was to fly high, like the pain bird, on your great journey. When you're sufficiently high up in the sky, you cannot hear the critics and naysayers at ground level. They can never reach your altitude. Summary for today. And this is we get to the primary lesson that Lao Tzu wanted to convey. It's the difference between most people and how you and I should be as Tao cultivators. We know most people care primarily about themselves, and that self-centeredness, self-centered focus, it can make them easily influenced by appealing to their self-concept. This takes them on a path of misfortune. They can make one mistake after another because they're working so hard to please everyone, to try to make everybody happy, an impossibility. The sages are different. Tao sages understand the significance of the self. With that statement, I'm actually covering a huge amount of material that we talked about today. It's the self in terms of the mental and physical selves. It's the self in terms of the true self. We even have self-nature from Zen Buddhism and no self or non-self from Buddhism. All of these are under the same topic of the self. What the sages do is that the care, the value, the love that they have for the self, they have transitioned that to something greater than themselves, a group, a community, nation, country, world, the list goes on. So, bottom line, they value and care for something greater. And this is their secret for living a life with meaning and purpose. A lesson that you and I can learn from. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.